The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as hundreds of tourists gathered outside the majestic palace gates. Among them stood Robert Hayes, a 72-year-old veteran whose weathered hands gripped a simple wooden cane. His gray hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, his posture remained straight and proud. The excitement in the air was palpable as visitors from around the world waited for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Robert had served his country for 30 years in the military, retiring as a colonel after multiple deployments overseas. He had witnessed the horrors of war, lost dear friends in battle, and carried scars both visible and hidden. After his retirement, he had led a quiet life with his beloved wife Margaret until she passed away 2 years ago. This trip to the palace was something she had always wanted to do together, and now he was fulfilling that dream alone, carrying her memory with him. The crowd grew thicker as the ceremony time approached. Families with children pushed forward, eager to get the best view. Tour groups clustered together following guides who held colorful flags high above their heads. Robert found himself gradually pushed toward the back, his mobility limited by his old war injury that made his left leg stiff and painful. He didn't complain, understanding that others were equally excited to witness this historic tradition. As he stood quietly, Robert's mind wandered to his military days. He remembered the discipline, the brotherhood, the pride he felt wearing his uniform. He thought about the young soldiers he had commanded, many of whom looked up to him as a father figure. The palace before him represented everything he had fought to protect: tradition, honor, and the continuity of his nation's heritage. A young mother with 2 small children noticed Robert struggling to see over the crowd. She smiled sympathetically, but was too focused on managing her excited kids to offer help. A group of teenagers nearby was busy taking selfies, completely absorbed in their phones. Robert didn't mind. He had learned long ago that people had their own concerns and responsibilities. The palace gates gleamed in the sunlight, their ornate metalwork telling stories of centuries past. Royal guards in their pristine uniforms stood motionless at their posts, their faces hidden behind ceremonial helmets. These young men and women represented the same values Robert had dedicated his life to serving: duty, honor, and commitment to something greater than themselves. As the minutes ticked by, Robert felt a familiar ache in his chest. It wasn't physical pain, but the deep loneliness that had become his constant companion since Margaret's death. She would have loved this spectacle, pointing out every detail with childlike wonder. She would have made friends with the strangers around them, sharing stories and laughter. Without her, everything felt muted, like watching the world through frosted glass. The crowd continued to swell, and Robert found himself pressed against the iron railings that separated the public from the palace grounds. His cane became tangled between people's legs, and he struggled to maintain his balance. A businessman bumped into him while checking his watch, muttering an apology without really looking. Robert steadied himself, his pride preventing him from asking for help. Despite the discomfort, Robert felt a deep appreciation for being there. This palace represented stability in an ever-changing world. The traditions carried out within its walls had survived wars, political upheavals, and social transformations. The same ceremonies his grandfather might have witnessed decades ago were still being performed with the same precision and respect. The sound of distant drums began to echo across the courtyard, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. The crowd's chatter grew louder with anticipation. Children were lifted onto shoulders for better views, cameras were raised high, and everyone pressed forward with renewed energy. Robert felt the familiar surge of excitement he had always experienced before military ceremonies, even though he was now just a spectator. Through the gaps between people, he caught glimpses of the guards beginning their preparation. Their movements were precise and deliberate, each step rehearsed countless times until it became second nature. Robert recognized the discipline required for such perfection, having spent years training soldiers to achieve similar levels of precision. A tour guide near him was explaining the history of the ceremony to her group, mentioning how it dated back centuries and represented the unbroken chain of service to the crown. Robert smiled, remembering how he used to give similar speeches to new recruits about the importance of military tradition and the honor of serving one's country. The crowd grew more restless as the ceremony's start time approached. Someone behind, Robert complained about not being able to see, and an argument briefly erupted between two families over standing positions. Through it all, Robert remained patient and quiet, his military training having taught him the value of maintaining composure under pressure. As he waited, Robert reflected on his own service record and the ceremonies he had participated in throughout his career. He remembered promotion ceremonies, medal presentations, and retirement parades. Each had been meaningful in its own way, marking important transitions in his life and career. Now, as a civilian, he was experiencing military tradition from a different perspective. The drumbeats grew louder, and the crowd fell into an expectant hush. Robert straightened his shoulders instinctively, his muscle memory responding to the familiar sound of military cadence. Despite his age and physical limitations, he felt a spark of his old soldier's pride igniting within him. Little did Robert know that in the next few minutes, his quiet dignity and patient endurance would catch the attention of someone who would change his entire experience at the palace. The ceremony he had come to watch would become secondary to an encounter that would restore his faith in human kindness and remind him that his years of service had not been forgotten by those who understood what it meant to wear a uniform. The ceremonial drums reached their crescendo as the palace gates began to open with a magnificent flourish. The crowd surged forward instinctively, everyone desperate to capture the perfect photograph or secure the ideal vantage point. Robert found himself caught in the human tide, his cane nearly knocked from his grasp as people pressed around him from all sides. Among the royal guards taking their positions was Sergeant James Mitchell, a 28-year-old career soldier who had been performing ceremonial duties for 5 years. James stood 6 feet tall with a commanding presence, his uniform immaculate and his bearing proud. Under his ceremonial bearskin hat, his sharp eyes constantly scanned the crowd, trained to notice anything unusual or concerning. James had grown up in a military family. His grandfather had served in World War II, and his father had been a decorated officer who had instilled in James a deep respect for veterans and military tradition. During his training, James had been taught that ceremonial duties were not just about pageantry, but about honoring the service and sacrifice of all who had worn the uniform before him. As the ceremony began, James noticed the elderly man near the back of the crowd struggling to maintain his footing. Something about Robert's posture caught his attention. The way he held himself despite his obvious discomfort, the dignity with which he endured being jostled by the crowd. James had seen that bearing before in older soldiers, a combination of pride and quiet strength that never truly fades. The changing of the guard proceeded with its usual precision. Commands were barked out in crisp, clear voices that echoed off the palace walls. The guards moved in perfect synchronization, their polished boots striking the ground in unison. Every movement was deliberate and meaningful, representing centuries of military tradition and unwavering dedication to duty. Robert watched in fascination, his trained eye appreciating the technical excellence of the display. He could see the countless hours of practice behind every perfectly executed maneuver. It reminded him of his own soldiers, the pride he felt when they performed flawlessly during inspections and ceremonies. The precision brought back memories of standing at attention himself, representing his country with honor and dignity. James continued to glance toward Robert during the ceremony, noting how the older man's attention never wavered despite his uncomfortable position. While tourists around him chatted, took photos, and showed varying degrees of interest, Robert remained focused and respectful. His behavior reminded James of the veterans he had met at military functions, men and women who understood the deeper meaning behind the spectacle. A particularly aggressive photographer pushed past Robert to get a better angle, causing him to stumble slightly. Robert steadied himself against the railing, his knuckles white as he gripped his cane. The incident went unnoticed by most of the crowd, but James saw it clearly. He also observed how Robert didn't complain or show any anger, simply adjusted his position and continued watching with the same quiet dignity. The ceremony reached its midpoint, and the guards began their most intricate maneuvers. Rifles were presented, inspected, and shouldered with mechanical precision. The crowd gasped appreciatively at particularly impressive displays of drill and ceremony. Children pointed excitedly, and adults nodded approvingly at the skill on display. James found his thoughts drifting to the stories his grandfather had told him about returning veterans after the war. Many had struggled to readjust to civilian life, their service often unrecognized or forgotten by a society eager to move forward. His grandfather had always emphasized the importance of remembering and honoring those who had served, regardless of when or where they had answered their country's call. During a brief pause in the ceremony, James noticed Robert remove a small photograph from his jacket pocket. Even from a distance, James could see it was an old military portrait, probably from Robert's own service days. Robert looked at it briefly before tucking it away, a gesture so private and poignant that James felt a tightness in his chest. The crowd around Robert continued to shift and move, seeking better positions and different angles for their cameras. A family with young children squeezed in front of him, their excitement understandable but further limiting his already restricted view. Robert simply smiled at the children and stepped back slightly, making room for them without complaint. James began to formulate an idea, something unprecedented in his years of ceremonial duty. The rules and regulations governing guard behavior were strict and clear. Maintain position, follow protocol, and never break character during a ceremony. But sometimes, James thought, the spirit of service demanded more than rigid adherence to rules. As the ceremony moved toward its climax, James observed Robert's quiet struggle with growing concern. The older man's face showed signs of fatigue, and his grip on his cane had tightened. Yet he remained in place, determined to see the ceremony through to its completion. His dedication and respect were evident to anyone who took the time to notice. The final phase of the changing of the guard began with a spectacular display of coordinated movement. The outgoing guards prepared to march away while the incoming detail took their positions. Commands rang out across the courtyard, and hundreds of spectators held their breath in anticipation of the ceremony's conclusion. James made his decision in that moment, knowing that what he was about to do would be highly irregular and potentially career-impacting. But he also knew that his grandfather would have expected nothing less, and that sometimes honoring the true spirit of military service meant taking risks. The ceremony was nearly over, and soon he would have an opportunity to act on his conviction. Robert, unaware of the attention he had attracted from one of the guards, continued to watch with the same respectful focus he had maintained throughout. He thought about Margaret and how she would have been moved by the pageantry and tradition. He thought about his own soldiers and the ceremonies they had participated in together. Most of all, he thought about the continuity of service that connected him to these young guards performing their duties with such dedication. The drumbeats began to fade, signaling that the ceremony was reaching its end. The crowd started to anticipate the conclusion, cameras at the ready for final photographs. Robert straightened his shoulders one last time, preparing to navigate his way through the dispersing crowd and make his slow journey back to his hotel. He had no idea that his patient endurance and quiet dignity were about to be rewarded in a way he could never have imagined. The final notes of the ceremony echoed across the courtyard as the guards completed their traditional formation. The crowd began to applaud enthusiastically, cameras clicking rapidly to capture the last moments of the spectacular display. Children clapped excitedly while adults nodded approvingly at the precision they had witnessed. The tourists started to disperse, chattering about what they had seen and planning their next destination. James Mitchell stood at attention in his position, his mind racing with the decision he had made. Protocol demanded that he maintain his post until officially relieved, but his conscience demanded something more. He had spent the entire ceremony observing Robert's quiet dignity and respectful attention, and he knew that this moment called for action beyond the normal requirements of duty. Robert began to slowly make his way toward the edge of the crowd, using his cane to carefully navigate through the dispersing tourists. His movements were deliberate and cautious, mindful of his limitations while maintaining the upright posture that marked him as a former military man. Several people brushed past him in their hurry to leave, but he remained patient and courteous, stepping aside when necessary. As Robert moved closer to the palace railings, James saw his opportunity. The formal ceremony had concluded, and while the guards were still required to maintain their positions, There was a brief moment of transition before the next phase of their duties. James had served long enough to understand the subtle differences between rigid ceremony and the more flexible moments that followed. The crowd noise began to fade as people moved away from the palace gates. Tour guides gathered their groups, parents collected wandering children, and the general chaos of dispersal filled the courtyard. In this organized confusion, James made a decision that would violate every rule of ceremonial behavior he had been taught, but would honor the deeper principles of military brotherhood that his grandfather had instilled in him. Robert reached the front railing and paused for a moment, looking back at the palace with obvious appreciation. The ceremony had been everything he had hoped it would be, and he felt Margaret's presence strongly, as if she had experienced it alongside him. He placed his hand briefly on the cold iron of the railing, gathering his strength for the long walk back to his hotel. James broke from his position. The movement was subtle at first, barely noticeable among the ongoing activity around the palace gates. But to anyone familiar with military protocol, what James was doing was extraordinary. Guards simply did not abandon their posts, especially not during public ceremonies with hundreds of witnesses present. Yet James moved with purpose and determination, his training evident in every step despite the unprecedented nature of his actions. Other guards noticed immediately. Sergeant Collins, James's squad leader, caught the movement in his peripheral vision and turned slightly, his expression hidden behind his ceremonial helmet but his surprise obvious in his posture. Lance Corporal Davies, positioned 20 feet away, actually took a small step forward as if to intercede, then stopped, uncertain about how to handle such an unprecedented situation. The remaining tourists, who were still lingering near the gates, began to notice something unusual was happening. A few pointed toward James as he approached the railing where Robert stood. Whispers started to spread through the crowd as people realized they were witnessing something that was definitely not part of the normal ceremony. Robert was completely unaware of the approaching guard. His back was turned to the palace as he prepared to leave. His mind focused on the careful navigation required to make his way through the remaining crowd safely. His cane tapped softly against the cobblestones as he took his first steps away from the railing. James reached the barrier that separated the palace grounds from the public area. This was the point of no return. Crossing this line would make his actions impossible to ignore or explain away as a simple adjustment of position. He paused for just a moment, thinking of his grandfather's stories about honoring veterans, about the brotherhood that connected all who had served regardless of generation or conflict. The few tourists still nearby held their breath, sensing they were about to witness something remarkable. Parents quietly hushed their children, instinctively understanding that something significant was happening. Even the palace staff members visible in the background seemed to pause in their activities, drawn by the unusual nature of James's movement. Robert heard footsteps approaching from behind but assumed it was another tourist. He continued his slow progress away from the palace, unaware that one of the guards he had just watched perform with such precision was now walking directly toward him. The irony wasn't lost on those observing. The veteran who had shown such respect for military tradition was about to become the focus of an unprecedented break from that same tradition. James called out softly, "Excuse me, sir." His voice carried the crisp authority of his military training, but was tempered with obvious respect. The few people within earshot turned immediately, their attention captured by the incongruous sight of a ceremonial guard initiating conversation with a member of the public. Robert stopped and turned around slowly, his surprise evident as he found himself face to face with one of the guards he had just been admiring. For a moment, neither man spoke. James saw up close the weathered features of a man who had clearly seen much in his life, the pride that remained despite obvious physical challenges, and the dignity that had impressed him throughout the ceremony. Robert looked into the young guard's face, seeing beyond the ceremonial uniform to the serious young man beneath. He recognized something familiar in James's bearing, the combination of respect and determination that marked true soldiers. After a lifetime in military service, Robert could read character in a man's eyes, and what he saw in James impressed him immediately. The courtyard seemed to grow quieter as more people became aware of the unusual interaction taking place. This was clearly not standard procedure, and the growing audience sensed they were witnessing something special. Cameras slowly raised but respectfully, as if the observers understood that this moment deserved documentation but also demanded reverence. James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either justify his unprecedented action or mark the end of his ceremonial career. But looking at Robert's patient, questioning expression, he knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes serving with honor meant serving the spirit of military tradition rather than just its rules. "Sir," James began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "I noticed you throughout the ceremony, and I wanted to thank you for your service." The words hung in the air between them, simple yet profound in their meaning. Robert's eyes widened with surprise, not just at being addressed by the guard but at the recognition implicit in James's words. Robert straightened slightly, his military bearing asserting itself instinctively. "Thank you, young man," he replied, his voice carrying decades of command authority tempered by genuine emotion. "But I should be thanking you. That was a magnificent ceremony. You and your fellow guards performed with exceptional precision and honor." James could see the pride in Robert's eyes, the way his posture had shifted from that of an elderly tourist to something more recognizable, the bearing of a soldier acknowledging another soldier. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who understood military culture. "May I ask which branch you served in, sir?" "Army," Robert answered, his voice growing stronger. 30 years retired as a colonel. Multiple deployments, various conflicts that probably don't mean much to your generation. He paused, studying James's face beneath the ceremonial helmet. "You have the look of a career soldier yourself, not just someone going through the motions." For tourists, the small crowd that had gathered to observe this unprecedented interaction grew larger. People sensed they were witnessing something special, a moment of connection that transcended the normal barriers between performers and audience. Parents quietly explained to their children that they were seeing something that rarely happened, while other tourists respectfully maintained their distance, allowing the two men their space. 5 years of ceremonial duty, sir, but 8 years total service," James replied. "My grandfather served in World War II, and my father was career military as well. They taught me to recognize and respect the service of those who came before us." He gestured slightly toward Robert's position during the ceremony. "I watched you throughout the entire ceremony, sir. Your attention and respect were unmistakable." Robert felt a warmth spreading through his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced since Margaret's passing. To be recognized not as a curiosity or burden, but as a fellow soldier by this young man in uniform meant more than he could express. "Your grandfather and father raised you well, Sergeant," he said, correctly identifying James's rank by his uniform details. The other guards remained at their positions, but their attention was clearly focused on the extraordinary scene unfolding near the railing. Sergeant Collins had initially moved as if to intervene, but something in James's demeanor and Robert's response made him pause. This wasn't a security breach or a breakdown of discipline. This was something else entirely, something that deserved to play out naturally. "Sir," James continued, "I noticed you were having difficulty seeing the ceremony from your position in the crowd. I was wondering if you might like to view the palace grounds from a better vantage point." The offer was unprecedented, potentially career-ending, and absolutely against every regulation governing public access to restricted areas. But James made it anyway, his conscience overriding his training. Robert's surprise was complete. In all his years of military service, in all the ceremonies he had attended both as participant and observer, he had never witnessed such a gesture. "Young man, I appreciate the offer more than you can know, but I wouldn't want to cause trouble for you. I'm sure there are rules about such things." "There are, sir," James acknowledged honestly. "But sometimes there are more important considerations than rules." He thought of his grandfather's stories, of veterans who had returned from war to indifference or hostility, of service that had gone unrecognized and sacrifices that had been forgotten. "Would you honor me by accepting my invitation?" The crowd watching this exchange had grown to include several dozen people, all drawn by the obvious sincerity and respect being displayed by both men. Some had their phones out, recording what they instinctively knew was a special moment. Others simply watched in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that transcended tourism or entertainment. Robert looked around at the faces watching them, seeing curiosity, approval, and genuine emotion in the expressions of strangers. He thought about Margaret, about how she would have urged him to accept this unexpected kindness. He thought about the young soldiers he had commanded, about the importance of honoring connections between those who had served. Most importantly, he thought about the courage this young guard was showing in breaking with protocol to show respect to an old soldier. "If you're certain it won't cause problems for you," Robert said slowly, "then yes, I would be honored to accept your invitation." The decision felt right, like a bridge being built between generations of service members, between the traditions of the past and the dedication of the present. James smiled, the first break in his ceremonial composure since the ceremony had begun. "Thank you, sir. Please follow me." He turned toward the palace gates, his movement purposeful despite the unprecedented nature of what he was doing. Several other guards watched the procession with expressions ranging from concern to admiration. As Robert followed James toward the palace entrance, using his cane to navigate the uneven cobblestones, the watching crowd began to applaud softly. The applause grew, not the enthusiastic clapping that had followed the ceremony, but something deeper and more meaningful. These strangers, tourists from around the world, recognized that they were witnessing an act of respect and kindness that transcended nationality or background. Robert paused and turned back toward the crowd, raising his free hand in acknowledgement of their response. His eyes were bright with emotion, and several people in the crowd wiped away tears of their own. This was what humanity looked like at its best, what service and sacrifice truly meant, what happens when one person chooses to honor another's dignity and worth. James waited patiently as Robert acknowledged the crowd, understanding that this moment belonged not just to them but to everyone who had witnessed it. When Robert was ready, they continued toward the palace entrance together, a young guard and an old soldier separated by decades but united by the timeless bonds of military service and mutual respect. Behind them, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the conversations that started would continue long after they returned home. Many would tell this story for years to come, describing the day they witnessed a guard break protocol to honor a veteran, the day they saw tradition serve its highest purpose by connecting hearts across generations. As James led Robert through the palace gates, they entered a world that few civilians ever experienced. The interior courtyard was magnificent, with perfectly manicured gardens, ancient stone walkways, and architectural details that spoke of centuries of history. Robert moved slowly but with obvious appreciation, his trained eye taking in the precision of the landscaping and the maintenance standards that rivaled any military installation he had ever seen. "This is incredible," Robert said softly, pausing to admire a particularly ornate fountain that served as the centerpiece of the inner courtyard. "I've seen many impressive military installations in my career, but this combines military precision with artistic beauty in a way that's truly remarkable." James felt a surge of pride, not just in the palace grounds but in his decision to bring Robert here. "Most tourists only see the exterior ceremony," he explained. "But the real history, the connection to centuries of military tradition, is here, in these courtyards where guards have trained and served for generations." They walked slowly toward a raised terrace that offered a commanding view of both the inner palace grounds and the public areas where the ceremony had taken place. Robert's progress was careful but determined, his cane tapping rhythmically against the ancient stones. James matched his pace naturally, understanding without being told that Robert's dignity required that he not be rushed or treated as infirm. As they climbed the stone steps to the terrace, Robert's breathing became slightly labored, but he waved off James's offer of assistance with a smile. "After 30 years of military service, a few steps aren't going to defeat me, young man, though I admit they're a bit more challenging than they used to be." From the terrace, the view was spectacular. The entire ceremonial area was visible below, along with the gardens and training areas used by the guards. Robert could see the precision with which everything was maintained, the attention to detail that reflected the same military standards he had upheld throughout his own career. It was like seeing the ceremony from the perspective of those who performed it, rather than those who merely observed. "Your grandfather would have appreciated this view," Robert commented, noticing James's obvious pride in sharing this special place. "There's something about seeing military tradition from the inside that makes you understand its true meaning. It's not just pageantry, it's a living connection to everyone who has served before us." James nodded, touched by Robert's insight. "He would have loved meeting you, sir. He always said that military service creates bonds that transcend time and individual experience. Looking at you now, understanding your appreciation for what we do here, I think I finally understand what he meant." They stood together, in comfortable silence for several minutes, two soldiers from different generations sharing a moment of mutual understanding. The tourist below looked tiny from this elevated position, their excitement and chatter distant and somehow less important than the quiet communion happening on the terrace. Robert reached into his jacket and withdrew the photograph James had noticed him looking at during the ceremony. It showed a much younger Robert in dress uniform, standing at attention with obvious pride. "This was taken at my promotion to colonel," he said, offering the photo to James. "I was about your age, full of certainty about my purpose and my duty." James accepted the photograph with reverence, studying the image of Robert as a young officer. The resemblance was clear despite the decades that had passed, particularly in the eyes and the bearing. "You can see the dedication even in the photograph, sir. That kind of commitment doesn't fade regardless of age or circumstance." "My wife Margaret took this picture," Robert continued, his voice soft with memory. "She was so proud that day, more excited about my promotion than I was. She said I looked like a poster for military recruiting." He smiled at the memory. "She would have been thrilled by today's ceremony, and even more impressed by your kindness in bringing me here." James carefully returned the photograph, understanding the trust Robert had shown in sharing something so personal. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, sir. Military families sacrifice as much as the service members themselves in their own way." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of another figure, Sergeant Collins, James's squad leader, walking purposefully across the courtyard toward them. James felt a moment of tension, knowing that his actions would now face official scrutiny, but he also felt no regret, understanding that some things were more important than strict adherence to regulations. "Sergeant Mitchell," Collins called as he reached the base of the terrace steps. His voice carried authority, but not anger, suggesting that while James would face questions, he might not face punishment. Collins climbed the steps slowly, his own ceremonial uniform impeccable despite the unscheduled nature of his visit. "Sergeant Collins," James responded, coming to attention instinctively. "I'd like you to meet Colonel Hayes, United States Army, retired." "Colonel Hayes, this is my squad leader, Sergeant Collins." Robert straightened to his full height despite his cane, his own military bearing asserting itself as he faced this new authority figure. "Sergeant Collins, it's an honor to meet you. I want you to know that Sergeant Mitchell's actions today reflect the highest traditions of military service and personal honor." Collins studied Robert for a moment, taking in the obvious dignity and the military bearing that remained strong despite his age. "Colonel Hayes, the honor is mine, sir. I hope you've enjoyed seeing the palace from this perspective." He turned to James. "Sergeant Mitchell, we need to discuss your deviation from protocol, but given the circumstances and the respect you've shown for a fellow service member, I think we can handle this as a learning opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter." James felt relief flood through him, but more importantly, he felt validation for his decision. "Thank you, Sergeant Collins. I understand that my actions were irregular, but I felt they were necessary to properly honor Colonel Hayes's service and sacrifice." "Sometimes," Collins said thoughtfully, "proper honor requires us to look beyond the letter of our orders to their spirit. Your grandfather would be proud of your actions today, Mitchell, as would mine." He turned back to Robert. "Colonel, if you're willing, I'd like to invite you to observe our evening ceremony from this terrace. It's a smaller, more intimate event, but it might give you an even better appreciation for what we do here." Robert's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. "Sergeant Collins, that's incredibly generous. I would be deeply honored to accept your invitation." He paused, emotion evident in his voice. "This day has already exceeded my highest expectations, thanks to the exceptional character of your men." As the three soldiers stood together on the terrace, representing different generations, different conflicts, but united by the shared values of service and honor, the palace grounds around them seemed to embody everything that military tradition was meant to preserve. Not just ceremony and protocol, but the human connections that give meaning to sacrifice and service. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the courtyard, and the tourist crowds had largely dispersed. Soon, Robert would witness another ceremony, this one more intimate and personal, shared with soldiers who had chosen to honor his service in a way that transcended regulations and protocol. It was a day that would restore his faith in human kindness and remind him that his years of service had not been forgotten by those who understood their true value. As the evening ceremony approached, Robert found himself in the unprecedented position of being an honored guest rather than a distant observer. James had arranged for a chair to be brought to the terrace, understanding that the elderly veteran's comfort was important for his enjoyment of the extended experience. The setting sun cast golden light across the palace grounds, creating an atmosphere of solemnity and beauty that enhanced the significance of the moment. Sergeant Collins had quietly spread word of Robert's presence among the other guards, and what emerged was a level of respect and attention that went far beyond normal protocol. The evening ceremony, typically performed for palace staff and a few official observers, had gained additional meaning through the presence of this distinguished veteran, who represented the broader military tradition they all served. "Colonel Hayes," James said as they waited for the ceremony to begin, "I wanted you to know that several of the other guards have served in conflicts overseas. When they heard about your career and your respectful attention during this morning's ceremony, they specifically requested to participate in tonight's event to honor your service." Robert was deeply moved by this information. Throughout his military career, he had always believed that service created bonds that transcended individual experience, but he had rarely seen it demonstrated so clearly. "Please convey my gratitude to your fellow guards," he replied. "To be honored by active duty personnel means more to me than any civilian recognition ever could." As the ceremony began, Robert witnessed something remarkable. The precision and discipline were identical to the morning's public display, but the atmosphere was different. This felt more personal, more connected to the actual meaning behind the movements and traditions. Without the pressure of entertaining tourists, the guards seemed to be performing for themselves and their profession, rather than for spectators. The evening light transformed the ceremony into something almost mystical. The guards' uniforms seemed to glow in the golden hour, and their movements took on an almost ceremonial quality that spoke to centuries of unbroken tradition. Robert found himself thinking not just about his own service, but about all the men and women who had worn uniforms in service to ideals greater than themselves. During a particularly moving moment in the ceremony, James caught Robert's eye and rendered a subtle salute, not part of the official choreography, but a personal gesture of respect between soldiers. Robert's response was instinctive and immediate, rising from his chair despite his cane and returning the salute with the crisp precision that 30 years of service had ingrained in his muscle memory. The other guards noticed the exchange, and something extraordinary happened. One by one, as their positions in the ceremony allowed, each guard acknowledged Robert's presence with subtle gestures of respect. A slight nod here, a more formal salute there. Each recognition building upon the others to create a moment of profound connection between past and present service. Sergeant Collins, observing from his command position, made a decision that would later be discussed in guard circles for years to come. As the ceremony reached its conclusion, instead of the standard dismissal, he called the formation to attention and addressed them directly. "Guards," Collins announced, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "we are honored today by the presence of Colonel Robert Hayes, United States Army, retired. Colonel Hayes represents the finest traditions of military service, having dedicated 30 years of his life to protecting the freedoms and values we continue to serve today. Robert felt tears forming in his eyes as he realized what was happening. This was not just recognition, this was inclusion, acceptance into the brotherhood of active service members who understood the true meaning of dedication and sacrifice. He struggled to his feet once again, his pride demanding that he meet this honor standing. "Colonel Hayes," Collins continued, "on behalf of all the guards present, we would like to present you with this." He approached Robert with a small ceremonial pin, the kind typically reserved for visiting dignitaries and fellow military officials. "This pin signifies your honorary membership in our ceremonial guard unit and our recognition of your lifetime of service." Robert accepted the pin with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from emotion. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day, "this honor exceeds anything I could have imagined when I woke up this morning. To be recognized by soldiers of your caliber, to be welcomed into your brotherhood, is a gift I will treasure for the rest of my life." The ceremony concluded with the guards maintaining their formation as Robert was escorted back down from the terrace. But as he reached the courtyard level, something unprecedented happened. The guards, still in formation, began to applaud. It started with James, spread to the guards nearest him, and within moments the entire formation was breaking protocol to show their respect for this elderly veteran. Robert stopped and turned back toward the formation, understanding that this moment would be etched in his memory forever. These young men and women, representatives of the military tradition he had served throughout his adult life, were honoring not just him, but everyone who had worn the uniform before them. It was validation, recognition, and acceptance all wrapped into one extraordinary gesture. As the applause faded, James approached Robert one final time. "Colonel Hayes," he said quietly, "thank you for allowing us to honor you today. But more than that, thank you for showing us what it means to serve with dignity and grace even decades after leaving active duty." Robert shook James's hand firmly, soldier to soldier. "Young man, you and your fellow guards have restored my faith in the continuity of military values and the importance of recognizing service wherever it's found. Your actions today represent the very best of what it means to wear a uniform." As Robert made his way slowly toward the palace gates, accompanied by James, who insisted on escorting him to the public area, he reflected on the extraordinary day he had experienced. He had come to the palace as a lonely widower seeking to fulfill a promise to his late wife. He was leaving as an honored veteran who had been reminded that his service mattered, that military brotherhood transcended generations, and that respect and kindness could still triumph over protocol and regulations. The tourists who had witnessed the morning's unprecedented events were long gone, but their stories would spread. Videos taken on phones would be shared on social media, accompanied by captions about respect, honor, and the unexpected kindness of strangers. The story of the veteran who was honored by a guard's courage would travel far beyond the palace walls, inspiring others and reminding people that human dignity deserves recognition wherever it's found. As James watched Robert disappear into the evening crowd, walking taller than he had when the day began, he knew that his decision to break protocol had been vindicated. Sometimes serving with honor meant serving the spirit of military tradition rather than just its letter. Sometimes the most important ceremonies were the ones that happened spontaneously, between individuals who recognized something valuable in each other. Robert Hayes returned to his hotel room that evening with the ceremonial pin carefully placed in his jacket pocket, next to the photograph of himself as a young officer. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt connected to something larger than his loneliness. He had been reminded that service creates bonds that never truly break, and that respect and recognition can come from the most unexpected sources. The next morning he would begin his journey home, but he would carry with him the memory of a day when a young guard's courage and compassion had transformed a routine tourist experience into a profound affirmation of the values that had guided his entire life. It was a reminder that military service never truly ends. It simply evolves into new forms of connection, respect, and shared understanding between those who have answered their country's call to serve.